Parliament is set to launch an inquiry into investigating the possible serious lapses of security forces during the recent unrest in areas of KwaZulu-Natal as well as Gauteng. Hundreds of businesses were looted, some burned down during the frenzy involving thousands of looters. At least 330 people have died. The unrest also sparked racial tensions following a deadly incident in Phoenix where at least 20 people were allegedly killed by residents claiming to protect their lives as well as their businesses from looters. The Democratic Alliance, however, wants the opposition MPs to chair the pending ad hoc committee to ensure that the process is transparent and credible. MPs decided last week to refer the establishment of the inquiry back to the Speaker, the NCOP chair, as well as the whips. Let's now welcome Member of Parliament and President of the African Transformation Movement, Vuyo Zungula, as well as DA Member of Parliament and Shadow Minister of State Security, Diane Kolabanat, who's joining us for this evening's conversation. We'd also invited the ANC, and they unfortunately couldn't participate in this evening's program. But remember that you can be part of the discussion via our online platforms using the hashtag Unfiltered. And tonight we're asking you, should President Cyril Ramaphosa be summoned to appear before the Commission of Inquiry into the KZN and Gauteng unrest that Parliament will be establishing? Good evening to both my guests, and thank you so much for joining us. Diane, let me start off with you. The suggestion that you made in that the co-chair of that ad hoc committee should be a member of the opposition party. Why is that important?
I think it's very important for the public to have a feeling that this is a legitimate process. It's not a matriculant marking his own paper, as it were. This is it's got to be credible. It's got to be transparent. It's really something that people are calling for. After you spoke of hundreds of businesses, it was actually 45,000 businesses that were decimated, many of them uninsured and cannot be replaced. So it has been catastrophic for certainly my province of KwaZulu-Natal, certainly large sectors of Gauteng, where this uninhibited manic looting went on. And of course, all eyes are turning to the security cluster. I mean, the SAP, State Security and Defence Force, everyone knew a week or so before the event began that there were threatening posts flying all over social media. They gave dates, venues for the protests and invasions in advance. And yet, to quote the Minister of Defence, they were caught with their pants down. We have specialised cybercrime units. Did they do nothing? Or was the information not acted upon? Those are the sorts of questions that have to be answered. Yeah.
But what powers would a co-chair have from an opposition party if you still have the ANC dominating that committee?
Well, I think in giving it credibility, in that the entire of Parliament is now participating, as opposed to being seen as an ANC show, as it were, I think would really give it the credibility it needs. A chairperson simply guides the process and guides the debate and guides the interviews. An enormous amount has to be done. An enormous number of people have to be interrogated, and a lot of information has to be seen and interrogated. So I think it's a credibility factor that must be taken into account.
Vuyo, from the ATM side, the inquiry itself, number one, where does the ATM stand on that? And then number two, the suggestion that's coming from the Democratic Alliance that the co-chair comes from the opposition.
Look, we've written to the Human Rights Commission to say there needs to be a proper inquiry, because we can't have more than 300 people dying and it's predominantly black people, and life continues as per normal in our country. As of now, there should be something whereby we should have had a state of mourning as a country, flags flown, half-mast, all of those things, because people have died and they've died in numbers. And another thing that we need to clarify is that we've seen from time to time government saying this was a coup or insurrection or any of those things, of which that is a blatant lie, because in a coup, people get to be arrested, people get to be charged for treason. South Africa would be the first country to have an attempted coup and no one gets to be charged for treason. And this thing, everyone knows that this, what has happened in the past weeks, got its root on the ANC factional fighting. Therefore, by having an ANC-led committee to also chair the process, we're playing basically because it'll protect their comrades. And I want to stress that the fact that an ANC factional fight has led to the death of more than 300 people, the losses in millions of businesses, shows that the ANC is not a government or is not a party that can govern this country into peace and prosperity.
Yeah, so we have seen, for instance, other ad hoc committees, and I'm just going to make an example here, Vuyo, is the Nkandla ad hoc committee, where you had members of the ANC appearing before the ad hoc committee, but it turned out to be what some would say hogwash. So what would be different this time around? Because the African National Congress still remains the dominant party within Parliament and surely would be the dominant party within this ad hoc committee as well.
What is important is that the manner in which it is constructed, it must give an equal opportunity to all parties to participate, particularly from a chairing perspective, because that is where you drive the conversation, you drive the deliberations in the committee. And what's important for us as the opposition parties, it is to get the truth out there. If people know that this ANC government led for the death of so many people in our country, and the people decide in October and again in 2024 to also to put the very same party that is responsible for the deaths of more than 300 people, it is for the people themselves to take responsibility for whatever challenges that we face in the country. That is why for us it is very critical that we need to go out there, hold the ANC to account, and not have a case whereby all of these truths regarding the source of these unrest gets to be suppressed. People must know where this unrest started from, who are the key participants, and how did the ANC participate? And also that statement that by the president of the country, by labeling it ethnic mobilization, what impact did that have in the people coming from, for example, Phoenix, saying we are going to deal with this particular ethnicity because the president might have said this is a mobilization this is an ethnic mobilization.
We'll come back to that particular part of the conversation, but just quickly in terms of the ad hoc committee itself, Diane, do you think that the president should appear before that inquiry?
I absolutely do. I think he's a crucial person to have in. He is, after all, the person who appointed the ministers of police, defense, and state security. So the buck stops with him. And
Vuyo?
The questions have got to be answered.
Vuyo, should the president appear before the committee?
Yes, to account on his statements that this was an ethnic mobilization and what impact did that have on the relations of South Africans, particularly in Phoenix.
Okay, and speaking about Phoenix, when we come back from the break, the conversation that we'll have is around Phoenix, because one of the proposals that the ATM had was that there should be a separate inquiry that focuses on the Phoenix question. That conversation just after this.
Race profiling and cases of lower middle class communities, black and white, excluding their more marginalized informal settlement neighbors. In a few localities, there was ugly criminal vigilantism, like in Phoenix, in Durban. That vigilantism was carried out in the main by some criminals within the Indian community. It would be reckless of us to then go out and condemn the entirety of the Indian community, because that would be playing into fanning ethnic chauvinism against the Indian community.
Okay, Vuyo, let's quickly get your reaction to what Blade Nzimande had said there, and also to that question that the ATM had raised before, that there should be a separate inquiry that focuses on the question around Phoenix.
What is important for us as the ATM is that what Parliament will do, it is a process that is political in nature, because it is politicians who are belonging to especially the governing party that will guide or chair that process. But an independent process that is driven by a Chapter 9 institution is a process that will help us as South Africans to actually get to the root of the problems, because the ANC itself will try to use its majority to suppress and protect one another. On what Mr. Blade Nzimande is saying, it is something that the inquiry must come to a conclusion about, to say this is what transpired. It's not enough for us to make speculations, because the time of making speculations, especially when people were murdered like animals, must come to an end. There must be a thorough investigation, and people must face justice for their acts of killing people, regardless whether it was an Indian that was killed or it was a black person that was killed. However, when the reports are stating that a lot of black people were killed because of their them being black in a particular area, must bring questions to us as the opposition parties as to what is the government doing to protect the lives of the ones who are vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Diane, your take on that as the Democratic Alliance, and I also note that John Steenhuisen was arguing, for instance, that that the Phoenix issue is being used as a scapegoat.
It is. It's to a large extent, people were attempting to say, well, that was the crux of the whole matter, which of course it was not. The crux of the matter was that all families in eThekwini and the rest of KZN were basically abandoned. They were phoning the police. The phones were not answered. They realized they were completely on their own. And I, like many civilians, stood at roadblocks trying to protect their homes and their families against, we were watching 3,000 people looting and burning in just down the road. At one particular area in Springfield Park, all over there were enormous numbers of people invading, and the threats that were flying over social media became more and more, let's go into the houses, let's kill the people. So people were scared, they were guarding their own places, and I don't think it needs a separate investigation. It must all fall under one umbrella body, and every murder that was committed, every person that died, the matter must be looked into very carefully. To as that clip you played said, to suddenly say there is some sort of ethnic mobilization of war. We had one man standing on the City Hall steps, basically saying one bullet, one Indian. I believe he's now facing various charges. So people have jumped on the racial bandwagon, but that's not what this was about at all. This was the playing out of the internal ANC infighting and factionalism, playing out on our streets, destroying our lives, destroying our businesses, and basically setting the economy of this province in particular back a decade. That's what happened.
Do you think that both can be true, that it could be ANC factional battles, but it could also be racial tensions that sparked what specifically happened in Phoenix?
I think it's an interesting dynamic, and I think it would need a great deal of studying and a great deal of unpacking. And if there were some people who were too quick to shoot and were perhaps using illegal firearms, they must go to jail. If there were people who were defending themselves against a gang of 30, then, as you know, the firearm legislation says if your life is in danger, or the person next to you or near you, their life is in danger, you have every right to shoot.
Yeah.
If someone is coming at you with a dangerous weapon, a machete, a knife, you still have the
but
right
isn't the
to.
difference here that there was that racial profiling? That it wasn't just any other person who was driving into Phoenix who would be facing this attacks from these group of men?
Absolutely. Look, I think that's got to be determined by the parliamentary investigation.
Okay.
I think we're talking about 360 people who've died. So we have to look into all of it, not simply focus or do a separate section for Phoenix. There were deaths everywhere, and they all matter, and they all have to be investigated.
For your fair point that Diane makes there, that there were deaths everywhere, over 360 odd people who have died, and all those deaths do matter.
Yes, each and every person who has died, in our view, those deaths do matter. However, you can't compare a case whereby a person, for example, went to loot in Game or ShopRite, and something fell from the top roof, they hit its head, and he passes on, and you want to equate it to a place or to a state whereby a person, just by merely being black in a particular area, they were deemed to be a threat and they were shot at. We know there are videos whereby in some areas, not limited to Phoenix, but in some areas around eThekwini, where just by being black, your car was stopped. There were cases of women driving with their babies, defenseless women. Their cars were shot at, their windows were broken just for being black. Therefore, we can't just say all lives matter in this case, whereas we know that there were specific cases whereby black people were targeted just because of their race.
But
therefore,
why do you think that Parliament won't be competent to look into that?
Parliament cannot be, because remember, you are dealing with an ANC-governed parliament, and this entire thing results from the ANC factional fights. So what the ANC will do, they will suppress each and everything that they will that will expose them or that will make them look bad in the eyes of the electorate. That is why it's critical you get people that are independent, people that are not looking to get votes or that are not looking to get re-elected anytime soon. People who are out for justice, not to protect their organization, because we know that each and every time there are cases of this nature, ANC will always put the ANC first. Now we need an inquiry that will put the interests of South Africans first and make sure that ultimately justice is served and we get to the root of the problem, because time has passed, Aldrin, that each and every time there are issues of this nature, we always put a bandage on the wound. Let us find space and time to get to the bottom of the problem and fix our racial issues for once and for all.
Okay, so when we come back, we'll have a conversation about, number one, we've dealt with the issue around the racial element to it, and also the ANC's own internal factional battles. But what about inequality itself, and it being a contributing factor to what we saw play out during those days of the unrest? That conversation after this. Welcome back as we have a conversation focusing on the unrest, but the parliamentary inquiry that will be set up to look into what led to this unrest, that we saw more than 330 people who died in the streets of this country. How did we get to this particular point? And also the thousands that took to the streets to go and loot those shops. Diane, so we're dealing with the ANC's factional battles, but what we also find is that there almost seems to be an exploitation of an environment that has become conducive for something like this to flare up. And with that
I think
said,
you're absolutely right.
How do we locate inequality in this conversation?
Well, I think what we saw was a very sophisticated event. We saw, number one, the taxis, bear in mind, they all shut down. The moment they realized their taxis were in danger, they shut down. And in many instances, they circled malls or petrol stations, saving them from being looted or burned. So we saw trucks bringing in hundreds of people to specifically to loot, to shopping malls, to the large Macros, other shops like that, which are now just ash. And every single item was stolen, and people were taking everything. It's not as though people were stealing food to eat or clothing to wear. They were stealing televisions and every other possible item one can imagine. So it was set up, and in amongst the people looting, there were professionals cutting open the ATMs, up to 6 or 7 per mall, and taking about, I've heard something between 20 and 25 million rand in cash. So that was very well organized. It wasn't distributed amongst the thousands looting the shirts and the shoes. It was taken very deliberately. So there were specific targets, starting with grocery store, well, the transport first, then the grocery stores, the sugar terminal, some sugar farms, very carefully and strategically laid out, and very careful and strategic things were taken from the malls, transponders and other things that could be utilized. And then, of course, the infamous container of ammunition, which was literally stolen. It has never been examined in Durban Harbour before. In 60 years of this company ordering ammunition, and on this occasion, in the midst of rioting and looting, the SAPS insisted that it was moved, and then it was dumped in a warehouse and, of course, looted.
Just quickly on that particular one, Diane, around the ammunition that was stolen and just the story around it, do you have a suspicion at all that it was an inside job, that it was well coordinated? It seems like the guys knew where exactly the container was and which container to target instead of targeting the others.
I have no doubt in my mind. It was an inside job. No one else could have known that a container, 3 containers up, was that specific one unless they were inside. And the SAPs were guarding it. There were others allegedly supposed to be guarding it. But the point is, it was deliberately taken down. It was deliberately moved away from the docks and then looted. Okay. And that ammunition, 1,500 bullets, they're out there now, and now they're being used to shoot back at police who are trying to go through areas to pick up the stolen goods, etc. So it all pulls together as a very serious attempt to overthrow the current regime.
Okay. Vuyo, on the question around inequality, where do you locate inequality in this unrest that we saw?
There are reports that have clearly stated that South Africa does have a risk of an unrest because of the high unemployment levels, huge inequalities that exist in our country. Therefore, a short-sighted response to what is happening will be saying this is an attempt to overthrow the government, but they will not get to the bottom of. So
you don't think it was an attempt to overthrow the state?
No, not at all. Let me ask you, Aldrin, if the government now says we know who the coup plotters are, which government can say we know who wanted to overthrow the government and not even one person is arrested? The only thing that the government will say is that we know who you are. On the issue of the majority of the people who took to the streets to loot, if your truck that is carrying beer or drinks or whatever gets to brown in the middle township, what is most likely to happen, people will go and loot. That is the realities of our country. If your truck were to get to be broken down in Sentinel or any of these places, nothing will happen. Therefore, what the government should be saying is that how do we practically make sure that we get people to be employed, people to be active economically, so that because this was a trigger, whatever that might have transpired in the past 2 or 3 weeks might have been a trigger. But you are not dealing with the root causes if you are just going to say this is an attempt to overthrow the government, or you give people 350 rands, whereas you should be transforming the economy so that people can participate meaningfully in the economy. Therefore, you won't have a case whereby there's so many poor people who can take it to the streets time and time again to loot because they've got nothing to eat.
Okay. Diane, just in closing quickly, on another issue is that do you think that there is a need in the administration itself, speaking about cabinet, for a Minister of State Security? Or is it something that should be left at a DG level, where you have the DG directly reporting to the president and just looking in, for instance, how the Minister of State Security had said that they had absolutely no signs of a coup or anything of that nature, whereas the president comes on national television and then speaks of an insurrection, and as Vuyo said, that we know who those people are?
I don't wish to counteract what you've just said, but I believe it was the Minister of Defence who contradicted the president and said there's no sign of an insurrection. It's not going to happen. We're not needed. The Minister of State Security has claimed that she in fact gave files of evidence, handed them over, which would have gone to Nat joints. The Minister of Police says, no, you didn't. So minister after minister, they're chucking each other under the bus in their attempts to keep their current jobs. But I think, the parliamentary inquiry must do its work, and we can never lose sight of the fact that on the 10th of this month, the former President Zuma's trial will resume. And this security cluster must be ready for another possible disaster. They must stop it before it happens. I don't want to have to be doing this program again in a month's time.
Thank you so much for your time, Diane, as well as we really appreciate it. And thank you so much for choosing Unfiltered with me, Aldrin St. Pierre, this evening. Enjoy the rest of your day.